Okay, so we have talked a little bit about what species are. So let's get into how they are organized and some of the geographic, um, I guess, components of that. So first of all, I briefly mentioned this guy, Carl Linnaeus, who, if you don't know who he is, he's just he's famous for naming a bunch of things. Literally, he named lots and lots of organisms, a ton of them. And he created the classification system that we pretty much still use today. So you've probably seen this at some point. Some of these this domain and life are sometimes not included on on there, but they're part of it. We won't get into this too much, but the classic kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Pretty much, I think everyone's been introduced to this. It's what is the Linnaean classification system, and it's pretty much what we use still. We've made some modifications to it, but essentially the foundation of it is still in place. But it does, as we've, through the centuries of scientific classification, we've come to realize that it does have some weaknesses. And a few of those are that, one is that taxa at the same level cannot be assumed to be equally related to one another. So just because all species, you might have all the species within a single genus are related, taxonomically, but that doesn't mean if you pick out two that they're as equally related as a different pair. Some may be more closely related to others, and this system doesn't really account for that. It's not standardized with respect to the timing of divergences, so you don't really get information about when one group split off from another group. Um, Clade names must be changed if they are repositioned within a hierarchy. A clade is just a group of organisms. So if you took a single family and then all of the genera and species within that, that would be a clade. If you took a single genus and had all the species in it, that would be a clade. But if you move any grouping around and you reposition it because you get new information, you have to change the name. The entire or the portion of it that's being repositioned has to be changed. And the same thing goes for species names. So even if you're working at the species level, if you reorganize a species somewhere, the species name has to change as well. So those are some weaknesses with the Linnaean classification system. Now, it was still revolutionary at the time, and it's still incredibly useful to us. So we still use it. It has value. Um, but it has these weaknesses, and it has led to a push. There is currently a move towards some different types of systems, although none of them have really gained that much popularity yet. So at some point, we'll probably move away from the Linnaean classification system, but for right now, it's still pretty much what we have. Okay, so I want to talk about some mechanisms of diversification here. And when we say diversification, I really sort of mean mechanisms of evolution and mechanisms of speciation. Those are all kind of the same thing going on. Although it's worth mentioning that you can have evolution. Evolution is always occurring. Speciation is not necessarily occurring because evolution is really just a change in gene frequency. And that's happening all the time. Like every time you get a mutation that changes the gene frequency, even within an individual, doesn't mean you're getting a new species. But anyway, let's get into some of this. So if we're talking about microevolution, which is sort of just evolution at pretty much the population and species level, there's four main mechanisms here, and these are like the four main ones of evolution in general that pretty much everyone has probably been exposed to in your biology courses at some point. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on them, but we'll walk through them as a refresher. Mutation, so you have mutation, genetic drift, natural selection, and gene flow. Mutation is just changes to sequences of DNA. So maybe you have some radiation or something that causes a mutation, and you actually get a change in the gene expression or the actual gene that's there. And so you're getting changes to actual sequences of DNA. And mutation is actually the source of just about all genetic variation. Maybe there's like some recombination and stuff like that that plays a role too, but mutation is pretty much the fundamental unit of it. But we're actually not going to spend too much time on it. We're more interested in stuff going on at the organism and in population levels. And so genetic drift is changes in allele frequency between generations that are random, so just random changes. So if you have a population of little beetles here and only a few of your beetles end up reproducing, and so the next generation looks quite a bit different. If this is only due to randomness, then that would be just genetic drift, just sort of the random changes over time. It's generally considered to be a pretty weak evolutionary force because very few interactions are actually random. There's all sorts of evolutionary and ecological pressures being put on organisms, and so there's just not much going on that's truly random. Where genetic drift can become a strong evolutionary force is in the event of a bottleneck. So if you have a drastic reduction in the population size, so only a few, if this is your population and the colors represent sort of genetic diversity, if you get a drastic reduction in the population and only a few members end up surviving, and those are the ones that reproduce, you can end up with a next generation that looks much different than what you originally started with, just due to the makeup of those individuals that happen to survive. So when you get these big reductions in population, called a bottleneck, you can have a strong impact. Genetic drift can have a strong impact. Also, they tend to lump founder events into genetic drift as well. I didn't have a slide for this one, but a founder event is just like those jump dispersal events that we talked about. If you have a few individuals that immigrate to a new location and they establish a population there, it can look much different. The genetic makeup can look much different than the original population from which those individuals came from. So both of those are sort of the same thing, where you're just reducing the number of individuals quite a bit. So here, natural selection. I always like I always like showing this little picture here. It's kind of brutal. I feel like it's kind of mean to the giraffes, but natural selection is something that occurs, and it's the one that I think gets the most misunderstanding. People think they know what natural selection is, but they usually don't. What it is changes in a population, genetic changes in a population that are due to individual differences in survival and reproduction as a result of genetic differences. So your genetic differences give you different individuals have different genetic makeups, and those genetic makeups give them different chances at survival and reproduction due to how well they're able to interact with the environment. So here, if you have tall giraffes, they're likely to be able to reach their food source, so they survive longer. If you survive longer, you're able to, your chances of reproduction are higher, and so your chances of passing on your genes of having, tall and long necks, for this example, will get passed on. I think what I hate about this is that people tend to think survival of the fittest is really what natural selection is about, and it's really not. You have to survive and you have to be able to reproduce. And so you have to be able to pass on your genes if they're beneficial. So then these two are different. So yes, you do have to survive in order to reproduce, but you do not have to reproduce in order to survive. So you could be an organism that lives your whole life and never reproduce, and you obviously had beneficial genes because you lived a long time, or a full lifespan, but you didn't reproduce, and so you didn't pass any of those on. So you have to actually reproduce. And on the flip side of that is you could reproduce at a very young age. Maybe you just reach sexual maturity, you have offspring, and then you die right away. Maybe you didn't have genes that were beneficial and you just happen to survive long enough to reproduce. You still pass on your genes, even though they're not necessarily the best genes for that environment. So it really comes down to these two things. You have to survive, and reproduction is a portion of it as well. So that's natural selection. And then there's gene flow. Gene flow is just the movement of alleles between populations due to dispersal. And so here, dispersal is sort of just like movement. We're not really talking about immigration here. We're just talking about dispersal. So if you have two populations, the movement of alleles from one population to the other, which happens from individuals moving from one to the other, is gene flow. And gene flow actually reduces the differences between these two populations. So if there's no gene flow, then these two are isolated and they're going to become more different over time. But if there's gene flow, then the differences will not be as pronounced because they're mixing between these two populations. Okay, so let's look at some examples and put some of this stuff together. Here we're looking at divergence of populations of monarch flycatchers, and this was originally attributed to a founder and bottleneck event, so a big reduction in the population through immigration. But recent analysis also suggested natural selection due to genetic and reproductive isolation. So you have these islands, and you have these birds that immigrated, these flycatcher species that immigrated out there and established on these different islands. And even if there was, dispersal between the islands, what happened was they evolved different song frequencies on the different islands, and the song frequencies played a role in, at least this is according to this research, and is probably what's going on. Song frequencies played a role in mating rituals in these birds, and so if the frequency, even before they had necessarily split into different species, if they had different song frequencies and sort of mating rituals and things, a member of this group may not have recognized a member of this group as someone or some member that it would have reproduced with, and so they used, it was the song frequency that sort of caused the reproductive isolation. Kind of interesting. Birds have some really unique things going on as far as natural selection, but also sexual selection, which is a little bit different. Natural selection is about survival and the environmental pressure that's being put on you to survive and whether you can reproduce or not. Sexual selection is different in that like a gender, both genders might have preferences, and so they're only going to reproduce with certain individuals. And so certain individuals that have certain traits that the other sex finds preferential will reproduce and others will not. And so that's going to also influence. And so it's a different actual force than natural selection. We're not going to get into it too much because this isn't really a course about evolution per se, but it's worth mentioning that there's natural selection, but also sexual selection that can occur. Differences in chromosome number can also reduce gene flow between populations, and this can facilitate natural selection of a specific population to its environment. So these are mole rats, and they at some point evolved different chromosome numbers in different populations. And so even if they're not geographically isolated here, they became reproductively isolated, which caused more adaptation to the local environment and was probably what allowed them to expand from the coastal environments here into more of the desert environments, because these individuals were not mixing with these individuals because they have different chromosome numbers, and so their reproduction wasn't compatible. And so they were more responding to the environment, and less gene flow created more diversification. So gene flow and natural selection can kind of be opposing forces in some cases. Differences in morphology between populations can result from reduced gene flow again and increased local adaptation. So in the Sierra Nevadas, there was a study where they collected seeds from vegetation from these plants. I think it's yarrow. I don't remember exactly what species these are, but they collected seeds from up like along an elevational gradient here. So starting at the base of the mountain and then working their way up. And what they found was that there was different morphology types, even within the same species, that were being found as they moved up the mountain. So these different morphology types, and it's not that they took individuals, so they took seeds collected from the soil and then grew them in a greenhouse. And this is what they found, is that the average heights tended to decrease as you moved up in elevation. And because they grew them in a different environment and just used a seed source, it's pretty clear that these are genetic differences, not necessarily a phenotypic response to something going on in the environment. It's not like it's just reduced temperature causing these individuals. Like, these individuals have actually undergone genetic changes to make them smaller in response to, or in comparison to, these individuals. And so some interesting, kind of interesting example of that. What is this guy? I think this is a deer mouse. So these are subpopulations of deer mouse species. So it's a single species that has all these different subspecies that all have pretty much independent geographic ranges, and there's tons of them. There's dozens of subspecies of this one thing here, all with their pretty much own independently sized and positioned geographic ranges. So you can get some pretty unique geographic patterns that can happen as a result of these things. Also, local environments can place unique selective pressures on organisms in different locations. So here we have members of the same species, this small mammal population that has vastly different morphological characteristics in response to its local environment. So whether it lives in a place where there's, I think, active lava flow or volcanic rock substrates is going to play a role in the coloration of the fur. And this is what's probably going on, is how well do these organisms blend in to their environment, and how well can they avoid predators is what's causing their morphological changes. Another example, so clutch size in birds. So clutch size is, how many eggs are being laid in a particular clutch or at a time. Tends to increase as a function of, or as the ratio of, actual evapotranspiration to the density of individuals. And that's kind of a weird thing to think about, but basically what you get, so if you're starting here, that means you have a low actual evapotranspiration to the density. Here you have higher evapotranspiration. And so it's probably getting at resource availability and primary production. And so as that increases, you get an increase in clutch size, which is interesting. I think there's been some debate about what exactly is going on here, and there's been some different studies, but this pattern does exist. So it's an interesting, fascinating thing that, if you're interested in, maybe keep an eye on that. Another interesting pattern is these ring species that can occur. And so you can get ring species can occur when variation in traits is in a circle around geographic features like a mountain or a lake. Here specifically, we have salamanders that occur in rings. So you get this ring of species, and they might form like sort of hybrid intermediate ones where they overlap, but otherwise they are just geographically and reproductively isolated from one another. And this is around California's Central Valley. So you get these sort of groups of species that can occur in a circle around things like a large desert or a mountain or a lake or some geographic feature like that, which is kind of interesting. Okay, I'm going to end this video here. You can take a little break here. There's going to be another video, so there's no reading between these two. So just keep working your way through the module. I'll see you in the next video.